Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
As we talked about at the top of the program, Pepe Escobar tweeted, "So this is how it happened. Burns met an Iranian delegation in Oman. He was told the Israeli punishment was inevitable, and if the U.S. got involved, then all U.S. bases will be attacked, and the Strait of Hormuz would be blocked. Burns said, 'We do nothing if no civilians are harmed.' The Iranians said it will be a military base or an embassy. The CIA said, 'Go ahead and do it.'" End quote. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. He is, of course, Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
You know, when I first heard Saturday morning about the attack, and when I heard about the drones and where they had been launched from and how long it took those, I said, wow, they really they came to an agreement fairly quickly about how this thing was going to be worked out. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, this presents multiple problems for U.S. imperialism. First of all, there's a distinct possibility that oil prices will spike if the piratical regime in Israel carries forth on an implicit pledge to attack Iran. You already see airspace shut in such a manner that we have rarely seen since September 11, 2001. It brings to mind the old adage from late Pentagon Chief Donald Rumsfeld. That is to say, if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it. Israel has a problem in Gaza with a tattered global image. And so they've decided to enlarge the problem by, on April 1st, no April Fool's Day joke there, attacking the Iranian legation in Syria. Iran obviously had the right to reply and respond and has done so in a measured manner. But now you see uber hawks like John Bolton, the former Trump national security advisor, suggesting that the United States sees the opportunity in league with Israel to try to inflict a major blow on the Iranian nuclear program and perhaps even overthrow the regime, which has been a fond wish of the uber hawks for decades now. That, of course, could bring this entire small planet to the cusp of World War III. And I'm afraid to say that that may not necessarily deter or detain the Israelis. What you see is that U.S. imperialism is trapped. It wants to focus on China, but is bogged down in Ukraine, and now is on the verge of being bogged down in Iran and West Asia more generally. The Israeli wild card does not recognize that despite it attaining so-called tactical victories, that is to say, by killing a number of Hamas fighters and occupying a good deal of Gaza, they keep encountering strategic defeat. And now you see the same thing happening in Iran. Aaron David Miller, the former U.S. negotiator with regard to the Palestinian question, said that with the Iranian attack, there is a new paradigm that Israel has to face since Iran showed that it can launch projectiles at a profuse level into Israeli territory. Israel apparently has not gotten the message that they were just subjected to a demonstration project to a degree by the Iranians. And now a new level of deterrence has been established by the Iranians. And when a nation keeps engaged in a so-called tactical victory and a strategic defeat, that's usually a sign not only of a paradigm shift, but a reflection of the fact that you've had a fundamental realignment of the global forces and the global correlation of forces. What I mean is that it's apparent that the U.S. and the G7, and by the way, it's very curious that Mr. Biden chose to consult the G7 for whatever reason. I thought it was an economic club when he was formulating some sort of strategy with regard to this latest crisis. But the G7, the United States, the Western European nations, plus Japan, were obviously being eclipsed by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus Iran, of course. And therefore, it's difficult in this context of the changed balance of forces for the United States and its allies to attain strategic victories. This will probably be the case for some years to come. Note that with regard to this latest crisis, in launching these various projectiles, we've told that the number is 300 and that a significant Israeli military base suffered substantial damage, that Iran expended perhaps a little over 1 million, and Israel and its allies expended a little more than 1 billion. That's unsustainable going forward. And in any case, if there is a further escalation of this crisis, unlike the current crisis, do not expect the Iranians to give the Israelis and their U.S. ally a heads up, letting them know 48 to 72 hours in advance that missiles are arriving. And then, of course, collateral damage from this whole story might be the Jordanian regime. The folks in Amman are quite upset that the Jordanians, although they put forward this excuse that they were defending their airspace when they collaborated with the Israelis, many in the Arab street are not accepting that particular excuse. We see that U.S. imperialism is trapped by the strength of the Israeli lobby, which means that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do not have much room for maneuver because both parties are dependent upon the Israeli lobby, and particularly billionaires with ties to the Israeli lobby. I'm thinking of, for example, Haim Saban of Hollywood, Egyptian Jewish origin, who is a major funder of the Democratic Party. I'm thinking of the Adelson family of Las Vegas, Nevada, with major gambling interests, not only in Nevada, but in Macau, China, interestingly enough. And of course, we're a major funder of the Likud party in Israel. I would also caution the Israeli lobby and those they purport to represent that there are some troubling signs that I hope their arrogance does not prevent them from paying attention to. What I mean is that as we speak, there's breaking news in Texas that Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Houston is in a snit with Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, because he's accusing Tucker Carlson of raising a kind of red herring, because Carlson has talked about what he sees as Israeli repression and oppression of Christians in that part of the world. Interestingly enough, playing the Christian card is becoming ever more prevalent amongst certain elements of the right. I'm thinking of the recent snit between the black woman flamethrower and conservative icon Candace Owens and her break and rupture with Ben Shapiro, a card-carrying member of the Israeli lobby. And so in any case, U.S. imperialism is not only being torn apart at the highest level because of these ancient religious contradictions, but now they're in the untenable position of somehow seeking to pressure China and Russia to sanction their fellow BRICS members, speaking of Iran, not to mention their fellow associate and colleague in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And in any case, even if the United States is able to pull the rabbit out of the hat and somehow emerge on the other side in a positive manner with regard to this current crisis, which I highly doubt, they still face a major contradiction with regard to China as we speak. Chancellor Scholz of Germany and a plane load of businessmen are breaking bread with Xi Jinping in Beijing. He's following the footsteps of Mr. Macron, who did the same just a few months ago. We also know that Europe writ large is split on the question of Russia. Hungary and Slovakia obviously are not on board. Serbia is not on board. And the U.S. poodle, speaking of Great Britain, may be on board, but its economy is headed to the basement. There's a new book by the British author Angus Hanton, vassal state, which sums up the parlous nature of the British economy, which has become a kind of low-wage haven for U.S. corporations. There has been loose talk in London of having Britain apply to be the 51st state and compete with Mississippi for low-wage jobs. How the mighty have fallen.
Additionally, if you could speak to the numbers, to the internal repercussions. We've got polls coming out now that it looks like about 3/4 of those 18 to 29 oppose the administration's approach. And the problem that the Biden administration has is these numbers are growing, not they're not stable. Your thoughts?
Well, there was an article in the New York Times on precisely that point about how the left of the Democratic Party has adopted the Palestinian question as a cause to be reckoned with. And this brings up the contradictions in U.S. mainstream politics, because obviously whenever folks on the left talk about trying to form a third party, they're hammered into line, bludgeoned into submission, told that they must stay within the ranks of the Democratic Party. And so, okay, fine, many of them are doing so. But now this particular issue of Palestine is helping to tear the Democratic Party apart. We saw what happened with the Michigan primary and other primaries when folks voted uncommitted. We shall see what happens with the Democratic Convention in the U.S. Midwest in a few months in Chicago. I dare say that there will be protests, perhaps not reaching the level of 1968, but perhaps challenging that particular ruckus. And so Mr. Biden has some very tough decisions to make. But as noted, he has contradictions that are going to be difficult to surmount. Speaking of the stranglehold to a degree that the Israeli lobby has on the coffers and on the machinations of his own Democratic Party.
Could you elaborate a little bit on your distinctions between the tactical victory and the strategic defeat? Because I'm wondering if that very sentiment will wind up defining a potential Biden loss in November.
Well, that's possible. And I think that if the potential felon, speaking of Mr. Trump, who was on trial as we speak in Manhattan, is somehow able to reappear in the White House in January 2025, that'll be both for the U.S. ruling class a tactical defeat and a strategic defeat, because he is going to try to pursue the same policies that he pursued during his 2016 to 2020 term. That is to say, enhancing tariffs on China, which will obviously disrupt the European Union, as already indicated. He will seek to weaken NATO, which will then further disrupt relations with the European Union and possibly with Britain as well. And so, once again, I think it's important to look at the United States and U.S. imperialism from 30,000 feet and recognize that you're having a fundamental shift in the global balance of forces. U.S. imperialism is on the back foot, not only U.S. imperialism, but the North Atlantic nations as a whole. And for the first time in centuries, an Asian nation, speaking of China, is in the passing lane. It's the current juggernaut with no end in sight.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.